Welcome to the Automotive Diagnostic Podcast. We're going to explore ways to sharpen our diagnostic skills, find learning resources, and hear from experts in the automotive field. I am happy to have Automotive Seminars as a sponsor for the show. Now, if you're not familiar, Automotive Seminars is a diagnostic technician training company. They've got a website that there'll be a link to in the show notes. And what they offer is top-notch training to technicians like us in the field. I've been taking their training courses for years and have got a ton of benefit out of it. They've got top-notch instructors, John Thornton, Scott Shotton, Scott Manna, and every other month they've got a 2-night course that you can sign up for. Join in, ask questions, and afterwards, you've paid for the course, you can access a recorded version whenever you want. You can rewatch the class 2 years later in case you wanted some details on it. And that is a fantastic feature. So make sure to check out the website to see what courses they have available and what's coming up in the future. Hey, what's going on, automotive world? Welcome to another episode of the Automotive Diagnostic Podcast. My name is Sean Tipping. I'll be your host once again for this week's episode. Thank you so much for joining me. I really do appreciate it. Appreciate all the feedback and everyone that I get to talk to about the show as well. So keep that coming. You can hit me up either through email or Facebook Messenger, and I will try to get back to everyone in a somewhat timely manner. If it's not immediate, don't worry. I'll get back to you at some point or another. But anyways, yeah, just thank you for listening to the show. It's been a very positive experience overall, interacting with the listeners and the people that are involved in this industry. So pretty cool stuff. But yeah, let's get into the episode here. Today's going to be relatively brief, but I thought it was a pretty interesting case study or studies, if you will. It's a problem on a Ram, Dodge, Mopar, Stellantis vehicle that I've seen a couple times now. And the first time I thought it was just kind of a one-off and that I would never see it again. And it was about maybe a year to year and a half time separation. I saw the exact same thing and it presented itself the exact same way, which up front, it's not super clear what I'm dealing with. Asking some questions of the customer is key. And I'll get into that. I'll get into all the details, but the way the symptoms present themselves at face value and what you actually end up finding wrong with the vehicle is interesting. So let me set up what we're actually dealing with here. It's actually two different vehicles. The first one was the 2012 Dodge Ram. That one was a 2500. I don't think the size of the truck matters so much as the engine, and the engine was a 5.7 liter Hemi V8 engine. The second vehicle, the one I just most recently dealt with, was a 2010. And that was a 1500, but it had the same engine. So there's a 5.7 liter Hemi V8 engine. Now, if you're not familiar, these engines have the MDS, which is the cylinder shutdown. Chevrolet GM's version is the AFM, but they take 4 of the cylinders, and through oil control to the valve lifters, they can shut off valve movement up to 4 cylinders at a specific time in order to turn it into a 4-cylinder, if you will, while you're cruising down the highway or under real light loads. And these systems have been around for a while. It's nothing new. But I do want to point out that those are present on these vehicles. They are an option, and it is relevant to what we end up finding is wrong with the vehicle. So anyways, 2 different vehicles, exact same problem. A shop calls me for a misfire that they're trying to diagnose. Now, in both cases, the shop had done mechanical work to these vehicles. Now, going forward, and I always try to get as much information as possible, but that's the key here, is getting as much information as you can up front of, hey, what was changed? What did you do? What did you swap out? What were you trying to fix? What was the original problem? You need to know all that stuff going in, and you could kind of see this stuff coming. And I did in the second case, but again, the way the symptoms presented themselves cemented it that, yeah, that's exactly what happened. First time around, I kind of had to interrogate the shop to get out of them what had been done to the vehicle. But anyways, I'm called in for a misfire, and after they've done some work to the engine, but they've also done the typical, hey, we put spark plugs in it, we put coils in it, we swap the fuel injector, put a new fuel injector in it, and they might say we checked compression. I take that with a grain of salt, but according to them, they've done everything, and it's still misfiring. And it's misfiring on one cylinder, according to the scan tool, according to what's reporting as a code, and it's a P0306, which is a cylinder 6 misfire. That's what they're getting. Again, same vehicles. Now, misfire data on Chrysler vehicles in general is limited. On these ones, that's included with that. If you go into the factory data, you're actually not going to see misfire data. You can even use YTech. You're not going to see it in the factory data. If you go into the global side of the tool, there's an option to watch live misfires. And a lot of aftermarket scan tools, I was using the Topdon on this one most recently, you can access the OBD2 functions through the enhanced side, right? So like most of the time I connect to a car, I'm doing the enhanced version, which is the factory side of the tool, if you will, where it identifies a specific vehicle. It communicates to all of the modules, not just the powertrain modules, like if you were in the global side. And it mimics the factory scan tool pretty closely. But when you're in the engine computer powertrain control module in this application, and you go to, like, you click on the module, you go into that main menu, it'll say things like read codes, clear codes, data stream, special functions, so on and so forth. There's a tab that you can click on in the aftermarket tool that says OBD2 functions. You can click on that, and there's another tab that says which cylinder is misfiring. So they make it pretty clear to you. And multiple aftermarket tools have access to this. You can go in and it's a live monitor. Now there's some other monitors in there as well that you could look at previous misfire data, but I find the which cylinder is misfiring data to be the most helpful because it's a live monitor. And not everybody knows those are there. At least a lot of shops I work with they will go off of the codes, which is what they were doing with this one, but they don't know that the counters are there. Okay, so I'm going to look at the counter and I verify what they're saying. You know, there's a P0306 in there and it is counting on number 6. Now, I think number 4 had a few misfires counting up, but 6 was like counting really fast, like dead whole. Now, the engine is definitely running rough. Seems to me like maybe more than one cylinder is missing, but it's definitely running rough. It definitely has a misfire, and it's definitely counting up on 6. And again, 4 is counting a little bit. One thing that you'll notice with a number of vehicles, if you have one cylinder that is a dead hole, you may have the cylinders close to it in the firing order count up a few misfires as well, right? So the cylinder before, particularly the cylinder after, I seem to see more than anything else, it'll count a few misfires if the misfire on the target cylinder is bad enough. You might have a couple others. And so anyways, I just noticed that there's a couple counts on 4, but 6 is our main suspect here. That's what it's coding for. Okay, so what do I do in this situation? Now, again, they've already swapped parts out, plugs. This one's got a couple plugs per cylinder, coils, fuel injector. Not to say that any of those are good, but in a situation like this, I'm going to do a relative compression test. Now, the first vehicle, the 2012 I worked on about a year ago, I did not get all the details up front about what had been done to the engine mechanically, and there had been some mechanical work done to this engine. The 2010 that I just worked on, I did question them as far as what did you guys do? And it ended up that they changed out a camshaft along with a number of other parts, but they had the whole engine apart. And I think it was the reason that they did that was from a bent push rod and a lifter that had ended up wiping out the cam, was what they told me they found. And so they reassembled this. So I know some mechanical work was done to this engine. Okay. But because of that, and realistically, I might do this on just about any vehicle, is I'm going to do a relative compression test. And before I even do the legit relative compression test with a scope, is I'm going to clear flood it, especially on a Chrysler where you can just hold your foot to the floor and crank it, and it's going to disable the fuel and just allow you to crank, and you just listen. And it definitely sounds like there is some low compression for an audible check. And that most of the time is going to be the indicator to me that I need to actually grab my scope and do a relative compression. I'm not in a shop. I don't have my Pico on a cart. It's a little bit of work for me to pull it out. I could do, use scope potentially too, but for screen captures for the invoices, if I'm going to go to the trouble of using a scope, I like to use a Pico. Obviously you can zoom in and put rulers in, so it's well suited for doing relative compression. But I'm going to use that audible check, that clear flood, just to verify, like, yep, it's worth pulling out the scope and hooking everything up and looking at this, because I can hear a cylinder that's low. And a lot of times at this point, I'm just trying to give them some more direction. I already know it's mechanical. You're going to have to figure out what's wrong. It's probably on cylinder number 6, but let's hook up the scope and see what we get, confirm it. We'll make sure. And then a lot of times what I'll ask them at that point is like, hey, do you want me to go further with this? I'll charge you X amount for showing up and telling you that you have a mechanical misfire. Here's the low compression. Do you want me to dig in any further to this? And maybe I'll pull a plug if it's easy to access and do a visual of the bore scope. That doesn't add too much extra time. But if the cylinder is difficult to get to, I might, offer them like, hey, it's going to be X amount dollars more. Maybe we need to take an intake off and do an in cylinder or some other waveforms. Right? We can use other test methods to dial it in even further. But I'm going to use that relative compression test just to show them, yep, here you go. You got a low cylinder. As far as compression goes. Now, you do want to be careful of washed cylinders where there's been so much fuel in a cylinder that it lowers the compression. That can be a tricky one and cause you to say, yep, that's just a dead mechanical hole. Replace the engine when a little bit of oil in the cylinder might have bumped the compression back up. So, be careful of that. But again, most of the time here, I'm just looking to say, yep, that one's low compression. Investigate, and the shop takes it from there, because a lot of these shops, they'll say, oh, I think it might be computer related. And actually this is a really good point here. I'm sure a lot of listeners of the show are aware of this, but maybe you're not. Maybe you're newer to this or don't do a lot of drivability diagnostics. The thing that we get a lot, and this actually was true of the second Ram as well. They thought it was a computer. They were actually pretty convinced. They were looking for us to source a computer for this vehicle, because I guess it was pretty hard to find this ECM used. They went through a bunch of stuff trying to figure out what it was, and they had gotten to the fact that it was a computer. And they were saying that the driver for the injector is shutting off. And they thought that was a problem for the PCM, right? The engine control module, powertrain control module, something was happening internally where the driver was shutting off for certain fuel injectors. Well, it was, but that's on purpose, and it's supposed to happen. It's the engine control module's, programmed method to save the catalytic converter, right? Once it sees a catalyst damaging misfire, which exceeds the federal test procedure by 1.5 times, if I remember my OBD2 stuff correctly, that it will, it has to code, obviously that's part of OBD2 standards, but in a lot of cases it's going to shut off the fuel injector to that cylinder, right? We know that cylinder is missing. We don't have combustion, meaning adding fuel to that cylinder is sending raw fuel into the exhaust, which is going to, significantly elevate the temperature of that catalyst and potentially cause it to melt down. And I'm not exaggerating by melt down. If you ever pulled a coil connector on an engine and let it misfire and the engine doesn't shut down that injector, you can watch that converter get red hot, like glowing red hot. It's crazy how hot those things get, and pretty fast too. It was actually at college, when I was teaching there, we were demoing some misfire stuff and strategies and stuff, and man, we didn't really let it run for very long at all without spark. And we looked down in this, I think it was a Chrysler 200 actually, and this thing's glowing red hot. And luckily that was a school car, so weren't too worried about the emissions performance of it. But anyways, that's the reason the computer shuts it off. So it's normal. But what happens is the shops, from whatever testing methods that they're doing, right, they're looking for fuel, they're looking for spark to be the problem. Number one, it's easier to fix. Number two, in both of these cases, they just went through the engine, so they're fairly convinced that nothing is wrong mechanically. But what they're thinking is that that driver in that PCM is shutting off. And I've had this in a lot of other applications. Chrysler seems to be a lot. I think Chrysler just has a lot of mechanical engine problems. But shops will think it's the computer's fault because the drivers for the injectors shutting off. No, it's normal, and I'll have to explain that. This is how this works. It's because it's seeing a misfire that's shutting those off. We need to get to the root cause of the misfire. And the easy way to verify that is turn the engine off. If you're monitoring the injector, start it back up. If the driver for the injector comes back, it's grounding the injector, you're good, right? It's working. Hey, have you ever been faced with the challenge of sourcing, installing, and programming a used control module in a vehicle? I know a lot of us have. It seems to be happening more and more often today with the volume of control modules on vehicles, the cost of some new ones, or even the availability of new control modules. In some cases, used may be the only option. So what do you do here? I strongly recommend checking out SJ Auto Solutions and Tommy Oliva. Tommy offers a cloning service for used control modules to make these things plug and play for the vehicle that you're working on. In a lot of cases, he is also able to source the control modules if you're unable to locate one for the vehicle that you're working on. But once you get connected with Tommy, he's going to offer fantastic support from start to finish to make sure that that control module is going to work in your application. He's also got tech support that he offers through his website, along with some free resources there as well on information about used control module programming. So make sure to check out SJ Auto Solutions. I can't recommend that enough. And if it drops it back out as soon as a misfire counts, well, there you go. It's normal, standard procedure for that ECM. That's what it's supposed to be doing. Okay. The other thing I get called in on when it's mechanical related, when you have this misfire, these are all speed density in like every Chrysler ever. And actually, I'll post a link to an episode. If you're curious to know how a mechanical misfire affects a speed density system, specifically in these Chrysler vehicles, because again, they have lots of mechanical engine problems. I have an episode I'll post a link to. It's like almost 4 years to the day. I had to look it up to see when I did it. It was back in August of 2020 when I just started the podcast. But I did an episode of rich running Chryslers, and that's the call that we get fairly often is, hey, the fuel trims are really negative on this thing, indicating that the PCM is removing fuel to try to correct for a rich condition. Well, really, it's caused by the mechanical misfire's effect on manifold pressure, which affects the MAP sensor, which drives the fuel delivery and is a major load indicator for the engine control module. So it's a series of events that all stems from, hey, you got a hole in your piston, right? One cylinder with no compression is going to cause a situation like that. So anyways, we get calls a lot for shops that think, hey, this is something really weird going on with the computer, when it's just a mechanical problem and the understanding is not there as far as how the computer reacts to specific things, right? If this is happening, this is what the computer is programmed to do. Or, in the case of that mechanical misfire, hey, the computer's just not set up to run an engine on 7 cylinders if it's supposed to have 8, and then the manifold pressure is jacked. I mean, it's doing what it's supposed to when it sees that manifold pressure. It's supposed to add more fuel. The engine load is up. We got more air moving through this engine, so we need to add more fuel. Well, if that's not actually happening, then you get a rich condition. So anyways, I'll stop yammering on about that. We do get a lot of calls where shops think it's computer related and ends up being mechanical. And I do a relative compression test or that audible cranking clear flood test just to say, okay, yeah, that's the route we were going. And that's the route we were going with both of these Dodge Rams. So I'm going to pull out the Pico and do an actual relative compression test here to see what's going on. Let's confirm it's number 6. Now here's where it gets a little bit more interesting. All of this so far has been pretty standard. These are a little bit unique. When you do the relative compression test, if you have the same problem that I have here, you will see 3 low cylinders compression-wise. And when I first looked at this, I was like, I wonder if some of these cylinders are higher than normal and I'm looking at this wrong. But I did some comparison and I found where number 6 was, and number 6 was one of them. I had 3 low cylinders as far as the amperage that the starter's using to push that compression stroke. It's lower than the rest of them. And this is consistent, right? You should crank these things for a while to see do you get the same result over and over and over and over again when you crank these. And I did. It's very consistent. 3 low cylinders, low compression compared to the rest. And the ones that are right after, the good cylinders that are right after low ones are a little bit higher. That's normal. You're going to see that in a compression waveform for the most part. But it seems to be that I've got 3 low cylinders. Now, like I mentioned, number 6 is one of them. But the other ones that have low compression are 4 and 7, right? And you can use spark on any cylinder and then use your firing order for these Rams. It's the same as an old Chevy 350, 184-36572. So you can use your firing order with the relative compression and a spark sync to figure out what the rest of the cylinders are. And I do this and it's repeatable. 4, 6, and 7 are all low on compression. Now, this is where, and I'm going back in time here to my 2012, the first one that I looked at. I considered in my head, I'm like, well, hang on a second. They just did some work on this. They had the engine apart, replaced the camshaft, and the shutdown cylinders, the MDS cylinders, which one are those? Well, those just happen to be 1, 4, 6, and 7. And I was thinking, well, this is pretty interesting that 3 of the 4 cylinders are low on compression, and they just change out a camshaft. Now, why number 1 isn't low on compression in the relative compression waveform, I don't have a great answer for that. I did not physically measure the compression. Why it's only counting on number 6, I find also pretty interesting. But again, when I looked at the second vehicle, the 2010 Dodge Ram, just a week or so ago, it was identically the same, only counting on number 6. The relative compression test showed 4, 6, and 7 to be low compression, and 1 matched up pretty closely to the rest. It didn't stand out as, hey, 1's got low compression too. But back when I was working on the 12, I'm like, I need to talk to them about, what they did to this engine or where they got the parts from. And this shop in particular has gotten parts from questionable sources before. It's always something I consider is like, they replaced the fuel injectors, but what spare engine did they have laying out back for 5 years that they took these injectors from, right? So I talked to them, but they had replaced it with an aftermarket camshaft and the lifters. And So I told them at this point, and this is again, I'll get to this point in the diagnostic and say, well, like, okay, we can, put the WPS in there and we can look at valve opening events and we can see if there's a measurable difference in the valve opening. Because that's what I'm thinking is something's different between these camshafts. There has to be. And I don't know this at the time that there was for sure, but I'm like, but it's very likely that something's going on there. Do you want me to go further in this, or do you guys want to investigate your parts? That's what I left him with. And he's like, we'll look into this. And really, they, again, are just looking for direction that, okay, this is compression related. It's also related to the camshaft that we just put in. We'll look into it, and then we'll let you know if we need to get you back for any more specifics. Well, what they ended up telling me was that their aftermarket camshaft did not match up to the camshaft that they took out of there. And that's all I heard of that one. I noted it. I noted the details in my notes. And again, I say it all the time, but take notes because this really helped me in the future. This was an instance where I pulled this up and I'm like, oh, great. I got everything right here. And it matches exactly the same situation that I'm in, a year and a half later. But I documented, said, hey, potential aftermarket camshaft here causing issues on 4, 6, and 7. Misfire only counts on 6. Again, okay. So to the present, 2010 Ram, I have the same situation, same symptoms. Relative compression gives me the exact same thing. 4, 6, and 7, all low on compression. Misfire counters in the ECM only counting on number 6. And as far as why, speculating on that, it might be because there are multiple low cylinders on compression. But I don't have a great reason as to why the computer is only picking up one misfire. It is very strange that that's happening, but it was exactly the same between the two. So I know I'm not making it up. I didn't miss anything as far as what the computer was showing me, but I'm in the same situation. So I talked to these guys. I'm like, hey, what happened here? What did you guys replace? And he said, well, we've had it apart a couple times now because after it didn't run correctly the first time, we tore it back down because we thought we screwed something up. And now this is why we got it back together. We verified the timing and we verified that all the valves move, rotating it by hand. And now we're thinking this is computer related, but, we changed out the camshaft, the lifters, and the push rod. Again, there was a bent push rod in the lifter that had wiped out one of the cam loops. Okay, well, where'd you get these parts from? And I'm thinking maybe this is, aftermarket. Maybe they got it from the same place this other shop got their camshaft from. Well, it turns out what they did was they put so I should start off with this. This is an MDS truck, right? So this is a cylinder shutdown engine. That's how it came equipped from the factory. It's got the solenoids and all that stuff. And they put the correct camshaft in for the engine. So the camshaft is for an MDS motor. However, they put lifters in from a non-MDS motor with the intention to delete the MDS. And this is the interrogation part where you got to ask about, what did you guys put in? How did you do this? Where did you get the parts from? So the lifters are from a non-MDS. And I think he said they tuned something out of the PCM too, but the lifters are from non-MDS. The motor is an MDS motor. The camshaft is an MDS camshaft. Looking back at my notes, the 2012 that I did, I noted that it was a non-MDS motor, according to the VIN, right? So we've got two different engines here. But after doing a little bit of digging, we did some reading on the difference between the MDS cam and the non-MDS cam. And I got to give some credit to a website, or it's a magazine, Engine Builder, and the title is Rebuilding the 5.7 liter Hemi. This had the exact information that I was looking for. And it talks about the camshafts between the MDS and the non-MDS motors, right? They're both 5.7s, but you have a cylinder shutdown version and a not cylinder shutdown version. It says cams, this is where it gets interesting because there are 5 applications that all share the VIN code T even though they're all different and they actually use 5 different cams that are not interchangeable. The cams for the MDS motors are unique because 4 of the intake lobes have a primary ramp that takes up the locking lash in the MDS lifter before the secondary ramp closes the check ball in the lifter. And it says the timing on the MDS exhaust lobes was advanced by a few degrees. Okay, so for 4 of the cylinders, the shutdown cylinders, the lobes on the camshaft are actually different in order to operate the specific lifters that are used. Now, what they've done here in this 2010 is they've mixed and matched lifters and camshaft in order to shut down. Now, why they didn't go with a non-MDS cam, I don't know. It wasn't my decision to make when they took the car apart. I'm wondering in that first 2012, after reading this, I didn't go as in depth back then. I just told them, hey, check out the camshaft, something's up there. I think they had an MDS cam in there. So they essentially had the same situation, right? An MDS cam with non-MDS lifters creates this compression issue. Now, why it only shows up on 3 of the 4 cylinders that are shutdown cylinders, I don't have a great answer for that. And it'd be interesting to take it apart and look to see, well, why does cylinder 1 actually register good compression? Now, that is only a relative compression waveform. I did not go through and physically check the compression on all of the cylinders. I don't have time for that in an average day. So I was going with, well, hey, here's what I see. Here's what you just told me you did. You need to get the correct lifters or the correct cam to match the lifters in this engine if you want it to run correctly. And that's what they did. They got it running correctly and no more misfires. So to sum it up, well, number 1, Chryslers have all kinds of mechanical misfire or mechanical engine problems. That's the first thing. But if you get a Mopar 5.7 liter with a misfire that's counting up on 6, but a relative compression that shows 3 low cylinders on 4, 6, and 7, I would definitely be questioning, hey, was anything done to this engine? Was anything swapped out? Did this get a different camshaft versus lifters? It's something that you need to look at. And the tough part about it is that it's not something visible you can see without taking it apart. You're going to need knowledge, but maybe something comes through the auction. Maybe it's a used car and you don't know the history. You could use a WPS and measure, the valve opening between a known good and a known bad cylinder and come to a conclusion that way. But the WPS in cylinder, probably the best way to say for sure, yeah, look at the valve timing on this cylinder versus this cylinder. And then, of course, it's a question of, is the cam wiped or not, but this should be not a shorter duration necessarily, but a different timing. Again, I haven't actually looked at it. You'd have to see some waveforms. And if I ever get one again, maybe that's the first thing I'll go to is let's get a few captures so you have something. But again, questioning what had been done to the vehicle is going to get you there. Like, hey, what parts did you use? Are you sure they're the right parts? I thought I would share that with everybody in case you run into it. Kind of a weird one, but there's all kinds of weird stuff that can happen to vehicles out there, obviously. So that's all I've got for today. Thank you for tuning in, and thank you for all the feedback. I always appreciate it. With that out of the way, let's get out there, start fixing the world, one car at a time.
Yeah.